They say the mountains breathe at night, exhaling a cold wind that carries more than just silence. Travelers speak of drumming in the distance, steady, rhythmic, almost human. But no tribe lives here, no ceremony is held. Trees bend where no wind blows, and something massive stalks just out of sight, always just out of reach. Survivors return with wild eyes, clutching weapons they never had the chance to use. There are no howls, no growls, only the feeling of being watched by something that does not want you here and never did. The Pacific Northwest had always been shrouded in mystery. The dense forests surrounding Grapevine Peak and Rainvale Wilderness Reserve were particularly notorious for strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. Throughout history, locals had whispered tales of enormous footprints found in remote areas and shadowy figures spotted between ancient trees. The indigenous tribes of the region had their own legends of the wild men of the woods, creatures that existed between the worlds of humans and animals. On April the 28th, 2025, the weather at Rainvale Reserve was typical for spring, misty, with patches of fog rolling through the valleys and clinging to the rugged slopes. The previous week had seen heavy rainfall, leaving the trails muddy and slick. Despite the challenging conditions, 3 experienced hikers decided it was the perfect time for their planned overnight expedition. Marcus Oliver, a 42-year-old geologist from Redbridge, had been exploring the wilderness areas of the region for over 2 decades. His detailed journals of previous excursions showed a methodical approach to outdoor adventures, with carefully plotted routes and extensive preparations. Julia Pierce, 36, was an environmental photographer whose work had been featured in several national magazines. She had joined the trip, hoping to capture the moody essence of the rain-soaked forest. Dan Foster, the youngest at 31, worked as a ranger in Silver Pine National Forest and was on his days off, eager to explore territory outside his usual jurisdiction. The 3 had met through an online hiking forum and had completed several successful trips together over the past year. This particular trail, known as Whisper Hollow Trail, was more remote than their previous ventures, a rugged path that wound through some of the densest parts of the forest before reaching a series of secluded alpine lakes. They had registered their hiking plan with the Reserve Service, noting their intended campsite and expected return time. Park records indicated that Marcus, Julia, and Dan entered the trail at around 7:15 a.m. The weather report that morning mentioned poor visibility due to fog, with temperatures around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. A park volunteer who checked their permits later recalled that the trio seemed upbeat and well-prepared, carrying appropriate gear for the conditions. Marcus had mentioned they were hoping to reach Falcon Rock Overlook by mid-afternoon, where Julia wanted to photograph the valley below if the mist cleared. What happened next was pieced together from sparse evidence, a single survivor's fractured testimony, and the unsettling findings of the search and rescue team dispatched 36 hours later when the hikers failed to return. According to Julia Pierce, who was found severely injured but alive, the group had been hiking for approximately 2 hours when the forest around them grew unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds and small animals had ceased, creating an eerie silence broken only by the soft patter of water droplets falling from the canopy above. Marcus had just commented on the strange stillness when they detected a foul odor permeating the area, something Julia described as a combination of wet fur and decay. The encounter happened with startling speed. Julia's statement to authorities, recorded from her hospital bed, described how a massive dark figure had suddenly emerged from the trees ahead of them. In the poor visibility, she initially thought it might be a bear, but as it rose to its full height, which she estimated to be well over 8 feet, she realized they were facing something else entirely. The creature moved with unnerving speed for its size, covering the distance between them in seconds. Dan was knocked aside in the initial rush. According to Julia, the creature struck him with a force that sent him sprawling into a nearby tree. He was later found with a dislocated shoulder and multiple bruises, injured but alive. Marcus attempted to lead the creature away, shouting for the others to flee. In the confusion, he became separated and fell down a steep ravine, sustaining fatal injuries. His body was recovered by search teams the following day. Julia herself had tried to hide behind a large fallen log but was discovered almost immediately. The creature seized her by the leg, dragging her through the underbrush before apparently being startled by distant movement, possibly one of the reserve's cougar patrol teams, and abruptly retreating. She lost consciousness shortly afterward and awoke hours later in severe pain, alone in the gathering darkness. Despite her injuries, a fractured femur, multiple lacerations, and a severe concussion, Julia managed to activate the emergency beacon in her pack. A helicopter search team located her the following morning, huddled against the trunk of a massive cedar tree approximately half a mile from the attack site. Dan was later located by ground crews, dazed but conscious, having taken refuge beneath a rock ledge during the stormy night. He was treated for moderate injuries and exposure. The official report from the Rainvale Medical Examiner's Office listed Marcus's cause of death as fall-related trauma with secondary injuries potentially linked to animal encounter. Though investigators noted signs of large claw-like abrasions, the pattern didn't match any known predator indigenous to the region. Reserve authorities and state wildlife officials publicly attributed the incident to a highly aggressive cougar, possibly driven toward populated trails due to recent habitat disruptions. They cited an uptick in sightings over the past 2 months as justification. A temporary closure of Whisper Hollow Trail and surrounding routes was implemented, while wildlife specialists conducted an extensive sweep of the area. However, Julia Pierce remained firm about what she had seen. In her interviews, she consistently described a bipedal creature covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, with a pronounced brow ridge and extraordinarily long arms. Most disturbingly, she recalled its eyes reflecting red in the dim forest light, similar to descriptions found in numerous unverified woodland giant encounters recorded in regional folklore. Local enthusiasts and independent researchers flocked to the area in the weeks following the incident, though they were kept at a distance by reserve personnel. Several claimed to have found large, unusual footprints in the vicinity, though no official confirmation was ever provided. 6 months after the attack, Whisper Hollow Trail was quietly reopened, with new signage about wildlife safety prominently displayed at the trailhead. Julia Pierce never returned to nature photography, relocating to Chicago and refusing further interviews. The official narrative remained unchanged, a tragic incident involving a rare animal attack. But around campfires and in the nearby towns, the legend of the Rainvale Howler lived on, adding another chapter to the enduring mystery of the Pacific Northwest's shadowed heart. Hidden Falls had long been a treasured natural landmark nestled in the heart of the Solombra Range in northern Sundaro Territory. On June 12, 2002, the weather at Hidden Falls Recreation Area was clear and warm, with temperatures reaching into the high 80s, ideal conditions for hiking and exploring the rugged terrain. The area featured dense groves of juniper and piñon trees, cliffs, and numerous hidden canyons that remained largely untouched by modern development. Ben Thornwall and Lucy Esposito, both graduate students from the University of Sundaro's Environmental Science program, had been planning their camping trip to Hidden Falls for weeks. The pair had been close friends throughout their academic careers, bonding over shared research interests and a mutual love for the Southwest's wilderness. This excursion was meant to be a celebration of completing their spring semester examinations. Park records showed that Ben and Lucy arrived at the main entrance around 10:30 a.m., purchasing an overnight camping permit at the ranger station. The attendant on duty later recalled the pair seemed in good spirits, though she noted some tension over which trail to take to the upper falls. Ben preferred the more challenging eastern route, while Lucy advocated for the established western trail. What began as a minor disagreement eventually escalated into a sharp exchange, according to another hiker who passed them near the trailhead. Rather than compromise, Ben and Lucy agreed to separate temporarily. Ben would take the steeper eastern route, and Lucy the main path. They planned to meet at the base campsite by mid-afternoon. Lucy followed the well-marked western trail, passing several other hikers. She reached the campsite shortly after 1 p.m. and began setting up. When Ben hadn't arrived by 3:30 p.m., concern began to mount. The eastern trail was tougher but not significantly longer, At approximately 4:15 p.m., Lucy heard what she later described as a desperate, strangled scream from the direction of the eastern route. Recognizing Ben's voice, she grabbed her day pack and headed toward the sound, leaving most of their gear behind. The area where the eastern trail neared the upper falls was rocky and steep, with visibility hampered by dense juniper growth. As Lucy climbed, she noticed an unnatural quiet. No bird calls, no insect buzz, just the steady roar of the falls. Near a narrow clearing, she found Ben lying against a boulder, groaning in pain but alive. His backpack was torn, contents scattered. He had deep gashes across his chest and arms, and his face was pale from blood loss. In her panic, Lucy was certain she saw movement at the tree line. A tall, broad figure with long, matted hair slipping between the trees with uncanny speed, but it vanished before she could make out the details. Lucy's call to emergency services was logged at 4:47 p.m. Rangers reached them about 40 minutes later, assisting with a medical evacuation. Ben was stabilized and flown to a trauma center in Cordessa. He spent 2 weeks recovering from his injuries, which included lacerations, cracked ribs, and a mild concussion. The incident launched a joint investigation. The attending medical team initially suspected a mountain lion encounter, but the wound patterns were unusual. A subsequent analysis by local wildlife experts concluded that while some injuries were consistent with a large feline, others suggested blunt trauma from something more bipedal. Claw marks didn't follow typical strike patterns. Tissue samples collected from Ben's clothing contained coarse, dark hair that lab tests failed to match with known regional species. Sheriff Raul Moreno issued a statement labeling the incident as a probable predator encounter, urging caution without drawing conclusions. Lucy, however, remained convinced they had encountered something unusual. In her interviews, she described a creature over 7 feet tall, covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, with long limbs and eyes that glinted unnaturally in the fading light. Her account drew the attention of cryptid researchers, especially those focused on legends surrounding the Salombra region. Local elders from nearby pueblos spoke of a guardian figure known as Sasquatch, or the Tall One, a being said to protect sacred springs and hidden places. Sightings, they claimed, were rare and often linked to violations of natural balance. Ranger Mateo Chavez, who had worked in Hidden Falls for over 2 decades, shared in a confidential report that this was not the first such encounter reported in the area. Though none had resulted in injuries before, he acknowledged a long-standing pattern of sightings that had been quietly logged but not publicized. The Thornwall family hired a private wildlife investigator who suggested that while mountain lions could not be ruled out entirely, the evidence left open the possibility of something undocumented. 6 months later, the Eastern Trail was reopened with updated signage warning of wildlife activity and advising hikers to stay in pairs. Ben returned to graduate school, but declined future backcountry trips. Lucy transferred to a university in Colorado and eventually left fieldwork altogether. In her final statement to the Rangers, Lucy said, "What hurt Ben wasn't just an animal, it was something else, something that didn't want us there." Visitors to Hidden Falls continued to enjoy its beauty, but local guides quietly reminded guests to respect the land and to listen should the forest ever fall completely silent. The Tall One of Salombra became part of the region's evolving folklore, a figure that stood at the boundary of wilderness and the unknown. The Te Urawara Reach stretched across the eastern regions of Aotearoa's North Province, a dense expanse of native bush that had remained largely untouched by modern development. In early December 1997, the southern hemisphere was transitioning into summer, with warm days and cool nights ideal for hiking and wildlife observation. The forest floor was thick with ferns and moss, while towering rimu and kahikatea trees formed a lush canopy above. The area was especially known for its bird life, including rare species that attracted ornithologists and enthusiasts from around the world. Peter Young, a 47-year-old ornithologist from the University of Tamakai, had organized an expedition to locate and document the gray-throated kotui, a rare wattlebird with dusky plumage rumored to still inhabit the region. Joining him were 3 colleagues, Sophia Harris, a 38-year-old conservation biologist, Mark Collins, a 35-year-old wildlife photographer, and Lisa Grant, a 29-year-old doctoral candidate studying endangered birds. The team had obtained limited access permits from the National Environmental Commission to enter restricted zones of the forest, with the agreement that they'd share findings with government researchers. They arrived in Hollow Tree Township on December 2nd, staying at a small local lodge before setting out early the next morning. Before they left, the lodge's proprietor, an elderly man named Harold Watkins, warned them about the valley they intended to explore, locally called Whisper Valley. The area had a long, whispered reputation for odd events. Over the years, hikers reported strange sounds, intense unease, and fleeting sightings of large shapes moving through the trees. Peter, ever the rationalist, dismissed these stories as folklore. They set out at dawn on December 3rd, hiking beneath clear skies. Their goal was to reach the heart of Whisper Valley by mid-afternoon, set up camp, and begin observations at dusk, when Kutui activity was likeliest. According to Sophia Harris, the group had been hiking for around 3 hours when the forest's normal ambiance suddenly vanished. Sophia later reported that all sound had ceased. No bird song, no insect hum, no movement in the leaves. The stillness felt deliberate, pressing. Mark remarked that this kind of silence usually signaled a predator's presence, perhaps a wild cat or a feral dog. Peter advised caution, but urged the group to press on, aware they had limited time in the permitted area. Roughly 20 minutes later, they heard a sound that shattered the stillness. A shriek, part animal, part human, but warped and resonant, echoing unnaturally through the bush. Mark suggested it might be a feral pig, but tension rose. Lisa wanted to turn back. Peter, eager to reach their objective, insisted they continue. They had just entered a clearing rimmed by ancient trees when Peter suddenly halted, gesturing ahead. Before he could speak, something large crashed from the undergrowth. Sophia described it as a blur, tall, fast, and disturbingly agile. Peter was knocked aside, not killed, his shoulder dislocated as he was thrown against a tree. The others scattered. Mark attempted to distract the creature, shouting and waving his pack. Sophia, panicked, tumbled down a steep embankment, striking her head and losing consciousness. Lisa's cries echoed briefly, then stopped. When Sophia awoke at dusk, she crawled beneath a dense tangle of roots and stayed hidden. She later described hearing slow, deliberate footsteps and low breathing near her hiding place. After what felt like hours, the presence left. She activated the team's emergency beacon just after midnight. A rescue team located her the following morning, disoriented, injured, but alive. Sophia had a broken ankle, lacerations, and signs of exposure. Search teams later located Peter and Mark, both alive but injured, found at opposite ends of the ridge. Peter had suffered a concussion and torn ligaments. Mark had severe bruising and shock. Lisa Grant remained missing. No blood was found where she was last seen. Her disappearance remains unsolved. The investigation focused initially on known predators. The leading theory involved a feral pig or dog, but no tracks were discovered, and saliva traces found on Mark's torn pack couldn't be matched to any cataloged species. Senior Ranger T. Ari Hura issued a public statement classifying the incident as an encounter with an unverified predator, likely mammalian, and suspended access to Whisper Valley pending further review. Sophia, in detailed statements to investigators, described the creature as upright, taller than any human, and covered in coarse hair. She remained consistent in her account, though officials did not endorse her claims publicly. Her testimony drew the attention of researchers in cryptozoology, many of whom cited similar reports from deep bush areas across Aotearoa. Local elders from the Ngamaru Iwi refused public comment, but quietly held ceremonies in the area. One elder, speaking privately, said that certain agreements with forest guardians were long forgotten by outsiders. Some valleys are not meant to be mapped, he said. Whisper Valley remained closed for over a year before reopening under the designation of a protected ecological reserve, with limited access for research only. Sophia Harris left fieldwork, later becoming a lecturer at Waihanga University. In her last statement on the matter, she reflected, "I've studied living things my entire life. What we met wasn't just undiscovered, it was aware of us, curious, maybe even territorial, but it wasn't random. It watched us first. The Te Urewara Reach continues to draw nature lovers, though guides now offer stern advice about Whisper Valley. The local phrase for that part of the bush is whispered with respect, Te Wahi o Te Mataki Nui, the place of the Great Watcher. The Kurokawa Forest stretched across the northern base of Mount Akuro in central Shinano Prefecture, a vast, tangled woodland long referred to by locals as Shikikai, the Sea of Mists. In the spring of 1974, Japan was undergoing rapid economic growth, with sprawling urban development extending from major cities like Tokyo and Osaka into once remote rural areas. Despite modernization, many in the region still respected traditional beliefs about the unseen world. In villages near Mount Akuro, elders spoke cautiously of yokai, supernatural beings, and of one in particular, the hibagon, a creature said to resemble the Western Sasquatch. Taro Sakamoto, a 43-year-old forestry specialist from Minato University, had grown disillusioned with city life. Drawn to nature's complexity, he planned a week-long solo expedition into the remote interior of Kurokawa Forest. Though his colleagues at the Ministry of Environment knew the area's hazards, they trusted his expertise. On April 12, 1974, Taro told his wife, Yumiko, and their 2 teenage children that he'd be unreachable for several days while he conducted personal fieldwork. He left detailed route maps with a colleague and packed supplies sufficient for 10 days. His objective, recorded in his notebook, was to document rare plant species and assess changes in the forest's ecology, particularly in zones affected by unusual compass variations. The first 2 days went smoothly. His entries described the thickening undergrowth, moss-covered lava rock, and the muffled stillness characteristic of the forest interior. The environment seemed untouched, even immune to time. On April 14th, the tone of his writing shifted. Taro noted discovering odd impressions in the soil near a glade. Massive humanoid footprints, approximately 45 centimeters long. He first hypothesized they could be from a bear, but the stride length didn't match any known animal in the area. His final entry, written on April 15th at 6:17 a.m., mentioned being roused before dawn by the sound of heavy movement around his camp. The footprints had returned. He planned to track them after eating. The note ended with a remark about a disturbing smell, musky, earthy, and wrong. When Taro didn't return by April 19th, his family contacted authorities. A search operation was launched involving local police, environmental officers, and experienced rangers. Using his map, they combed the deeper sectors of Kurokawa. On April 21st, Ranger Kenji Nakamura located Taro's final campsite. The scene was unsettling. His tent was shredded, gear scattered, and the ground stained. But roughly 30 meters away, behind a fallen cedar, they found Taro, badly injured but alive. Taro had suffered multiple fractures and deep lacerations, but was conscious when evacuated. He later told investigators that he'd been attacked by something tall and fast. He described a massive figure covered in hair, with long limbs and a face more human than animal. He remembered being struck and dragged before managing to crawl away and hide. The official report, though initially vague, concluded that Taro had been attacked by a large animal, possibly a bear or wild boar, though no definitive evidence supported either claim. Wildlife biologists reviewed the case and acknowledged the wound patterns were strange, more like blunt trauma than bites or claws. DNA traces lifted from Taro's clothing revealed primate markers, but the lab was unable to match the sample to any known species. Despite pressure to downplay the cryptid angle, several investigators privately admitted that the physical evidence contradicted standard wildlife behavior. Plaster casts made of nearby tracks showed a bipedal gait and unnatural proportions. Villagers near Kurokawa, less skeptical, spoke quietly of the hibagon, tales passed down through generations. Described as a guardian of the deepest woods, it was said to avoid humans unless provoked or trespassed upon. Shinto priest Takashi Mizuki of Tensho Shrine, located on the forest's outskirts, offered a more spiritual explanation. When approached by a local news outlet, he suggested that the forest was a liminal space, one not meant for prolonged human presence. Though careful not to mention Taro directly, he emphasized the importance of respecting boundaries between realms. Yumiko Sakamoto received her husband's journal shortly after his release from hospital care. A year later, accompanied by a guide and priest, she returned to the site to leave offerings. She later told friends that the forest felt watchful, like it remembered, she said. In the years following, occasional hikers in Kurokawa Forest reported fleeting glimpses of a tall, dark figure moving through the mist. Rangers often explained these away as shadows or wildlife, but off-record, some admitted to similar sightings. The Self-Defense Forces, which conducted periodic training nearby, issued strict rules about entering certain sectors of the forest, officially due to unstable terrain, though some retired officers hinted at other concerns. Kurokawa Forest remained as it was, ancient, secretive, and still largely unmapped. Whatever Taro encountered that April morning, he survived, but his story became part of a growing folklore, a reminder that some places, no matter how beautiful, may never fully belong to us. Villareu, a mountainous region situated just northwest of São Amaro, had long been regarded as a place where reality and fantasy intertwined. Beyond the manicured estates and historical ruins, however, lay the dense forests of the Serra Moura, vast woodlands that stretched across the peaks, harboring secrets far removed from any tourist itinerary. Local folklore spoke of supernatural entities residing in these woods, from the donzellas veladas, veiled maidens, to more menacing creatures said to stalk unwary travelers who ventured too deep into the labyrinthine forest. Children grew up hearing stories of lights that floated among the trees and voices that called your name in the dark. Elders warned of the curse of those who disrespected the old places, those who entered without permission, who whistled after nightfall, or who dared to laugh near certain stone formations believed to be sacred. These weren't just quaint tales, they were warnings, wrapped in myth. In July 2014, the country was experiencing an unseasonably humid summer, with sporadic thunderstorms breaking the intense heat. The forests around Serra Moura were particularly lush that year, their vegetation thicker than usual due to spring rains, creating impenetrable walls of greenery in some areas. Locals commented that the woods smelled different, more pungent, more alive, as if the rain had awakened something older and deeper in the roots. Trails that were normally passable had turned into a tangle of vines and slick moss-covered stones. Several hikers had already reported getting disoriented in the deeper zones, even in areas they had explored dozens of times before. On July 28th, 3 friends decided to explore the less-traveled paths of the Serra Moura. Carlos Lima, a 36-year-old local history teacher with a particular interest in folklore. Sofia Pereira, a 29-year-old botanist researching endemic plant species of the region. And Rui Alves, a 33-year-old photographer specializing in natural landscapes. The trio had met at a cultural preservation society in São Amaro and had become friends through their shared interest in the nation's natural and cultural heritage. Though their outings were usually uneventful, this one had carried an unusual weight. Carlos had been insistent about this location, almost too eager, claiming he had recently come into possession of a reliable oral account from a reclusive elder who had once lived near the woods and claimed to have seen O Guardião with her own eyes as a child. She had refused to speak further unless Carlos brought an offering of honey and rosemary, which he had done. Their excursion had been planned for weeks, with Carlos suggesting they investigate an area locally known as O Bosque dos Sussurros, the Whispering Woods, a section of forest that tourist maps didn't feature, but that appeared in several local legends. According to stories Carlos had collected from elderly residents, the area was supposedly home to strange phenomena, including unexplained sounds and glimpses of shadowy figures that were neither human nor animal. He had also noted geometric stone structures within the forest, arranged in patterns resembling stars or ancient sigils, which were said to be sites of protection or passage, depending on the story. The group set out from the small parking area near Casa Montaraz shortly after 10 a.m., following established trails for the first hour before Carlos led them onto a narrower, overgrown path that wound deeper into the forest. Sophia had been documenting various plant specimens along the way, while Rui photographed the increasingly dramatic terrain as they climbed higher into the mountains. Weather records for that day showed increasing cloud cover throughout the morning, with humidity levels rising steadily. By early afternoon, when the group stopped for lunch in a small clearing, the forest had become noticeably darker under the dense canopy and threatening skies. The air had grown still, oppressively warm, and the buzzing of insects gave way to long stretches of silence that made even small sounds, cracking branches, shifting packs, seem loud. It was during this break that Carlos shared more details about the legends associated with the area, including stories of a tall, hairy creature that locals called O Guardião, the Guardian, supposedly an ancient entity that protected certain sacred sites within the woods. According to one version, O Guardião was not a beast, but a punished spirit, once human, cursed by forest gods for revealing the location of a holy grove to invaders. Doomed to remain within the woods for eternity, it was said to guard the forgotten paths between worlds. Carlos admitted that he didn't know how much of this was allegory and how much was truth, but noted that multiple accounts across different villages repeated key details: the height, the hair, the voice like gravel and wind. Sophia's field notes later indicated that around 2:30 p.m., they realized they had strayed from their intended route. The landmarks Carlos had expected to find were nowhere to be seen, and the increasing similarity of the surrounding forest made navigation challenging. Rui's GPS device was showing inconsistent readings, possibly due to the dense tree cover and mountainous terrain. Compasses spun unpredictably. Even moss, traditionally a north-pointing indicator, seemed to grow on every side of the trees. As they attempted to reorient themselves, Sophia described hearing the first unusual sounds, something she called rhythmic thumping, like heavy footsteps, but too regular to be human. Carlos suggested it might be water dripping after the recent rains, amplified by the acoustics of the forest. Rui, according to Sophia's account, had become noticeably tense, mentioning several times that he felt they were being watched. At one point, he raised his camera to take a photo of a copse of trees and lowered it immediately, claiming there was something wrong with the lens, though the equipment later showed no technical issues. By around 4 p.m., with daylight already beginning to fade under the thick cloud cover and forest canopy, the group decided to head back in what they believed was the direction of the main trail. It was at this point that the situation deteriorated rapidly. According to Rui Alves, the sole survivor, they had been walking for approximately 20 minutes when they heard a sound that froze them in place. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere above them in the trees. Before they could react, something large crashed through the underbrush behind them. Rui caught only a glimpse, a dark, massive form moving with surprising speed for its size. Carlos was taken first. Rui described seeing his friend yanked backward with such force that he was lifted completely off the ground before disappearing into the vegetation. Sophia screamed and began running, with Rui close behind. They became separated when Rui stumbled over a fallen log, briefly losing sight of Sophia. When he regained his footing, he heard her cries coming from somewhere to his left. Following her voice, Rui found himself in a small ravine where he discovered Sophia's body. The official report would later describe her injuries as consistent with extreme blunt force trauma, though Rui's statement included details too horrific for the public record. How her limbs had been twisted at impossible angles, how deep gouges marked her torso as if made by enormous claws. In shock and terror, Rui had hidden himself in the hollow trunk of a massive chestnut tree, remaining there as darkness fell completely. He described hearing heavy movement around his hiding place throughout the night, accompanied by sounds he could only describe as not animal, not human, but something in between. At one point, he claimed he heard something breathing just outside the hollow, slow, deliberate inhalations that seemed to shake the very air, followed by a pause, and then a sound like fingernails dragging across bark. At dawn, when no sounds had been heard for several hours, Rui managed to find his way back to a marked trail and encountered a group of early morning hikers who called emergency services. A search and rescue operation was immediately launched, with the Guardia Forestal Nacional coordinating efforts to locate Carlos and recover Sofia's body. Carlos Lima's remains were found late that afternoon, approximately 2 kilometers from where Sofia had been discovered. His condition matched hers, evidence of tremendous force having been used against him, with injuries that the medical examiner would later struggle to attribute to any known predator. The official investigation by authorities initially focused on the possibility of a wild animal attack, though large predators had long been extinct in the region. When that theory proved unsustainable, attention briefly shifted to the possibility of an escaped exotic animal. No supporting evidence was ever uncovered. Forensic material from the victims included unidentified hair samples and saliva that contained DNA categorized as primate, but not matching any species in existing databases. These findings remained in classified segments of the investigative file, later leaked to independent researchers. Rui Alves's statement remained consistent through multiple interviews. He described a creature standing over 2 meters tall, covered in dark brown hair, with elongated arms and a face that appeared almost human, but wrong. Officials dismissed these descriptions as shock-induced hallucinations, and the public conclusion remained attack by an unidentified large predator, possibly canine. Local reactions ranged from disbelief to grim acceptance. Elder villagers quietly resumed placing traditional offerings at the forest's edge, a custom older than any written record. Younger residents rolled their eyes but avoided whispering woods all the same. Authorities closed several unofficial trails permanently, citing habitat protection. New signs warning of biological hazards appeared at key entry points. Rui Alves never returned to fieldwork. He moved to Marval, where he worked quietly in commercial photography. Years later, when asked about the incident, he simply said, "It wasn't the forest that frightened me. It was what was watched from within it." The woods of Serra Moura remain a place of beauty and unease. On misty days, when the peaks vanish into clouds and shadows stretch beneath the trees, stories of O Guardião live on. Quiet reminders that some corners of the world still keep their secrets well hidden. Takashima Island, the northernmost of the fictional Shinren archipelago, had long stood as the nation's wild frontier, an untamed land of volcanic ridges, frigid lakes, and ancient forests untouched by time. The deeper you went, the darker the woods became, dense with fir, spruce, and elm that swallowed sunlight and silenced even the birds. To the indigenous Isamu people, these forests were sacred. They believed divine spirits known as Kamui dwelled within the trees, some kind, others vengeful. Even after modern development reached cities like Kasumi, rural villages still treated certain parts of the forest with quiet dread. One of the more persistent legends was that of the Koropokuru, hairy, humanoid creatures said to dwell in the deepest parts of the island. Outsiders called them folklore. Locals didn't argue. They just stayed away from places where the trees grew too thick and the snow came too early. In 1983, Tetsuo Kobayashi, a 47-year-old hunter from Kibara, knew the forest better than most. Raised by a grandfather who'd learned from Isamu elders, Tetsuo respected the woods and feared what he couldn't explain. On the morning of October 19th, the season's first snow had blanketed the hills. It was perfect for tracking wild boar. Tetsuo told his wife, Michiko, he'd be home before nightfall. He carried his hunting rifle, a hunting knife, and enough supplies for the day. By noon, he was high in the ridge country, following fresh tracks into a narrow gorge. That's when the forest changed. No birds, no wind, just stillness. The air smelled wrong, like iron and wet fur. Then he saw the prints, 5-toed, nearly twice the size of his boot, and deep. Whatever made them was heavy, bipedal. He pressed on cautiously, eventually finding the shredded remains of a deer, tangled in tree roots. Steam still rose from the carcass. He crouched beside it, then froze. A low, throaty growl rumbled behind him. Tetsuo turned and raised his rifle just as something massive exploded from the undergrowth. All hair and fury, it slammed into him with the force of a charging bull, knocking him onto jagged rocks. The rifle discharged, useless. He tried to draw his knife, but the creature raked its claws across his shoulder. then grabbed his leg and dragged him several feet toward the trees. He fought, slashing blindly. A lucky stab to its thigh made it roar and release him. Blood sprayed onto the snow. Tetsuo scrambled backward, his body screaming in pain. The creature stood there, half hidden in the mist, towering, breathing hard, one arm bleeding. It stared at him with eyes not quite human. Then it turned and vanished into the trees. Tetsuo crawled for hours, leaving a crimson trail through the snow. He blacked out once, but managed to reach an old trapper's shelter by nightfall. There, he treated his wounds, wrapped his leg, and waited for morning. What made the experience even stranger, Tetsuo later recalled, was what he saw etched into the bark of several trees along his crawl to safety. Long gouges and strange symbols that resembled neither animal claw marks nor human writing. They were arranged in patterns that repeated every few meters, as if whatever had attacked him had been marking territory or sending a message. These signs, though weathered, appeared recent, cut deep through frost and lichen. He had seen similar markings once as a child, carved into an old shrine stump deep in the woods, which his grandfather had forbidden him to touch or speak of. It took 2 days to hike back to Kibara. When Michiko opened the door, she barely recognized him. Pale, bloodied, haunted, he spent weeks recovering. Authorities dismissed his story as a bear attack, though the wounds didn't match any known animal. He stopped hunting after that, stopped going into the mountains entirely. In later years, when asked why, he would only say, "There's something older than us in those woods, and it remembers when we forget."